we want to delete anything that was the original version. And to do that, we can go into our Z plugins in the subtool master, and we can use the delete invisible subtools, and just saying that it can't be undone. Make sure that you save a version before you do this. And now we just have everything that we subdivided. So make sure that everything is visible. You can shift, make everything invisible and visible, holding the shift key and clicking the eye icon for visibility. We don't necessarily want to create a live Boolean with everything here. There are certain objects we know we do want to create a live Boolean with. And it's important to sort of make those points of contact set up so that they're nice and clean. And that's what I was doing when I was making some small transformations to things, setting it up so that the live Boolean wouldn't be edges wouldn't be hanging out oddly or anything like that. So we know we want to connect this lower capsule to all these ribs, and then this ring and this upper capsule. It's not as imperative for these actual rings here, these bands that cover up the core. Nor is it imperative for the switch, this base and the pin to really be attached together. So once you have the subtools visible that you know you want to Boolean together, and they're at their highest subdivision, so make sure under the geometry subpalette that they're at their highest subdivision level. Go back into the subtool menu, and at the top level, go ahead and click that arrow. So we've got the start, and it'll give you a extension of that arrow. Make sure that live Boolean is activated, and then go down to the Boolean little menu in this subtool palette and click on Make Boolean Mesh, and it's going to add based off of whatever Boolean setting you've got it set to. At the default, it's at a union, and it's going to add all of these together. And so you're going to have this U-mesh, and then the first subtool that's in the list, which you can rename this, I'm going to call this Boolean Nougat Grenade, because we're going to end up appending this into something that the rest of the object. And you'll notice that you get, something that is fairly neat and orderly. You'll see the triangulation that's occurring where these are coming together. This is pretty consistent with what you'd see in any type of Boolean application. But with ZBrush, we can also go into the geometry menu, and we can open up Dynamesh, turn the blur down, crank the resolution up to something around 1000, and go ahead and Dynamesh it. And you'll see that everything maintained its contours, but we evened out all of the topology, preserving any of the bevels and things like that. And this is to set it up to do any type of sculpting. And I'm going to go into our layers and create a new layer. And we're just going to call it Detail 1. Make sure we're in record mode. And then we can go in and start to add different types of details. One detail that I'm going to add to start out with is a little bead right around the edge of where these meet this kind of core object. Because some of the normal information that we're going to create on this will be on in Substance, where we're going to add things. We might add some of the bolts in here, but we'll put some detail in Substance. We might do some dings and dents in Substance, some of the fine surface things, but there might be some actual detail information about the structure of it that we're going to add. I'm also going to add a little bit of like tack welds, spot welding, and things like this. And that's just a matter of like how this might be fabricated. You know, if you're thinking post-apocalyptic and things like that, that might be the case. So I'll create one layer that's just detail. I'm going to go under my transform menu, activate symmetry, turn it on in the y-axis, add radial symmetry, and crank up the count. I'm just going to get a standard brush. I'm going to try to shift and straighten my view out and move in here. And we're going to just get the draw size down a little bit. Bring the focal shift down. And with a stylus, very lightly, and then holding shift to smooth this out a little bit. Just something that indicates the end of one surface and the beginning of a different surface type. And you can make that as pronounced or as subtle as you want. And then just go ahead and try to do a type of matching. And if you create it like that and you want a little bit more of like a crease in there, you know, go to something like your Damien standard. This is the type of thing that you could do in Substance, but you're going to have to make sure that your UV layouts are very, very straight, and sometimes that's not always the case. So sometimes creating details like this in ZBrush is just as good of a way to go. Get a little bit in there. Doesn't have to be perfectly identical, but just sharp enough that we see a little bit of a form break, sort of giving the eye some indication that there's going to be a surface transition in there from this metal to some type of either glass or plastic that's got, you know, an exposed core. And we could do a similar thing here just to indicate a form change at this point as well. But I'm going to keep this layer separate from anything else I do. I add another layer, and we'll go ahead and name this, and I'll just call it welds. And then we can work on this because, you know, we can bring the opacity of these layers down just like you can layers in Photoshop. The only thing you got to remember about these layers is that it's all based on the subdivision level at which they're at. So if you change subdivision levels at any time when you've got multiple subdivision levels on your subtools, if you move them around, you're going to lose this the ability to work on this information. So just make sure you know at which subdivision level you're working. So with this, I'm going to use something like the clay buildup brush. Let's turn off our symmetry. I mean, we could do something that's more along the lines of radial symmetry with maybe a count of 4, and that would bring it up against the edge of each of these. So as you were sculpting one, you'll be sculpting all of them. And we can start with one and then start to make it a little bit more unique. Really what I want to do is start with a pretty low intensity of around 20. And again, if it doesn't work out, you can always undo this. But really what I'm trying to do is fashion some type of what would be a painted over weld. So if there was some fine welding that occurred at these points, just a little bead weld that went along here. It didn't have to be beautiful. You know, you could smooth it out. But again, as you're holding shift, just keep an eye on your intensity. And with welds, you never really want to make them uniform. We're just kind of starting at one point right in here and working our way in. You know, and if this was sort of a 3D printed form as opposed to something that was steel, you know, wouldn't have these types of welds. It would be printed, so it would be much nicer. But I'm, you know, going along the sort of production process that it would be something that would be manufactured from parts. I'm going to add on the details layer a little bit more information. You can see it only stays symmetrical with the areas that are symmetrical, just to the point that you need it. Just creating some smaller details. Along with, you know, going between this layer and the weld layer. And just make sure that you go ahead and click on that record button so that you can record detail and it'll turn off the other layer. So a little bit of welding, a little bit of these small beads just to help break up the shapes and give some indication of form transitions, a little bit of the manufacturing process.